Is the Cubism say Monday or Tuesday?
Tuesday, I think, isn't it? What does it say? Does it say Monday?
It says Tuesday, but you said Monday.
Yeah, because I'm confused.
I just thought maybe.
No, go with the printed version. I got my other class meets Tuesday, Monday, Thursday, so I'm doing the same thing to them. I'll say Friday when I mean Thursday, and just please correct me. I'm old, right? The gray has caught up with me, and now I make mistakes, right? Okay, so we left off with Matisse, and we were talking about how did he get to Fauvism, right? And we left off by talking about the fact that spending the summer of 1904 in Saint-Tropez with Paul Signac seems to have had a major influence on getting Matisse to adopt this idea of separating color from description, right? And Signac still uses color descriptively, but he had separated color into these individual points of color that optically blend for the viewer when you look at it from a distance, right? Your eye just like old TV sets, right? Just had dots, or even newspaper printing, right? Had dots that your eye would blend. And I think that certainly is a crucial starting point for Matisse. But he pushes it in a different direction because Matisse is quite obviously not interested in color blending, right? When he puts the paint down there, he wants the reds to remain distinct reds. And he wants the greens to remain distinctly green. So where Signac wants the greens and the reds to come together to make an orange, right? Or maybe the brown of the bark of the tree, he wants them to blend. Matisse wants them to remain distinct, right? Matisse wants those colors to keep their own independent character, right? So as opposed to color blending, what Matisse is most interested in, deriving from pointillism, but very different, is color juxtapositions, right? Color combinations, maybe is a better word. Juxtaposition sounds too contradictory, right? He's interested in color combinations in his work, rather than the idea of optical blending or color blending. And from this point, moving from these smaller strokes that we see in the summer of 1904 to what he's doing the next year in the summer of 1905, he simply makes the pieces of color larger, right? The areas of color become broader as he develops into what we now consider to be the sort of the Fauve movement. And we left off talking about this quote from Baudelaire, which is the basis of the title of the work, which I think is, when we think about when artists actually title works, even if the work is untitled, we should think about what the title is, right? And this is what modern art is very different from earlier periods. Rembrandt didn't title this. I'm working on this class for next semester. I've been reaching out to curators and all of them. And I'm just thinking through that, Rembrandt is on my mind now. He didn't title his paintings. He didn't hang them in an exhibition somewhere with a label next to them with the title. That's not how he sold paintings. And the idea of artists titling their works is giving them a very distinct title that this is how I want you to read the picture, is a relatively modern idea of the 19th century, right? Maybe 18th. We'll get some of it, right? But it's relatively new. And when the artist tells you this is what I think this is really all about, then we should probably listen to them, right? And try to think, why did they choose that particular title versus another one? Even if the title is untitled, right? Even if the title is just Composition 24, right? So for him, calling this luxe, calme et volupté, richness, calm, and sensuality, he wants us to think about what Baudelaire was saying in this poem. We could probably even benefit from reading this poem in its entirety. But I just pulled out the lines around that word where he talks about the fact that there is only order and beauty. Right? What does richness, calm, and sensuality mean to Baudelaire? It means you put these things together and you get order and beauty. And I think that is exactly what Matisse is doing. That he wants the richness, the calmness, the sensuality of his paintings to sum up to order and beauty. And that will remain the focal point of his career from this point forward, really, is an attempt to use painting not to represent so much, but to create a world of order and beauty through the richness and the sensuality of color. Right? Create a world of order and beauty. And he even says so much. I think I gave you that famous quote by Matisse where he talks about the fact that he wanted his paintings to function like a good armchair, that you can come and relax in at the end of the day. And that ties directly into this quote from Baudelaire. So let's come back and look at some details. We talked about the open window in Collioure on Tuesday, but I wanted to sort of dive back into this because, again, we keep in mind he's trying to create a sense of order and beauty through this sort of sensuous, rich color. You can see that within the intervening year, he still has some of the individual strokes that suggest his roots in pointillism, especially around the flowers at the bottom. But he's also broadened the areas of color to become significant portions of the work. And he's, in addition to being very much interested in how the colors sort of map out, combine against each other, he's also interested in how he's putting the paint on the canvas. He's paying attention to sort of the application of paint. Because an artist has the opportunity in painting, right, to do things with the medium, such as thin it out or leave it thick, to put it on wet or put it on dry, scumble it, right, to blend it or not. And Matisse is playing with that the more we look. We can see areas where he's working wet and wet and dragging colors from dark into light, but we can also see other areas where he's putting it on very dry and dragging it across the canvas and having it just catch on certain areas, right? Like dirt on your trousers, you know, poop on your shoe, right? And it just grabs and drags. But there's so many areas where the colors that he's putting in are just there for the color harmonies. This orange, blue, and red stripe through here doesn't really seem to relate to any kind of observed reality. They're there as part of the harmony of the composition. So my Wi-Fi is still not behaving well. There we are. We can see, I think, with some of these details, the degree to which he's working the different areas in different ways. And what's fascinating is, I think, on a certain level, that this interplay between thinner paint and thicker paint, right? I'm going to get it back and forth. So the frame of the painting here is painted quite thickly, right? But not all of it. Some of it's painted more thinly. The wall behind it painted more thinly. We see back and forth between the different areas. We'll get these areas of thin paint immediately adjacent to areas of thick paint, back and forth, right? Wherever we are. What that ends up doing is it makes you very aware of the surface, right? And as your eye wanders around the canvas, you become increasingly aware that you're not looking through an open window, right? He keeps reiterating that even though the painting's motif is a window that is open onto a bay, and paintings had been considered windows going back to the Renaissance, right? Going back to the beginnings of the use of perspective. The idea is the painting is a window that extends our space. I think Matisse is aware of this. That makes this kind of an important picture, even though it's very small, right? We're not looking through anything, right? It's not an extension of our space. It's a surface. It's a flat surface with stuff, right? And remember what was the critic that said that a bucket of paint has been thrown in the public's face, you know? And I think that kind of sums up on a certain level, even though it's a negative critique, some of what is the strength of Matisse is that you're so aware of the palpable object quality of the painting rather than its subject matter. The fact that it is an object rather than a representation. Right? And you can see here the degree to which Matisse is really interested in mixing up the ways in which he lays that paint down. The reflection on this window, very, very thick. The reflection on that paint, not so much. Right? You'll also notice that the perspective of the panes of the French windows as they open up is really off, so that the pane closest to the flat area on the bottom on the right is just placed inaccurately, right? Doesn't make perspectival sense. And that's not a mistake. He's doing that, again, to sort of violate the idea, to sort of negate the idea that we're looking through space. And that instead we look at it. We look at the surface, right? The plants here in the foreground, where again we have that sort of post-pointillist treatment of paint, but then not everywhere, right? But the thickness against areas, some of which are bare canvas, right? Not all of them, but some of them are still bare canvas. And that again reminds us that we're looking at an object rather than a representation. Some of the colors are just sort of luscious. They can remind me of ice cream, nice mint ice cream cone at the top of this, right? And yes, that's supposed to be boats, right? It's supposed to evoke these boats, but as we get up close, then all of a sudden you realize that it is really just so almost spontaneous. And I'm reluctant to use that word because I think Matisse is incredibly deliberate, right? And spontaneity doesn't really sell it for all it is. But even at this point, you can see that some of the paint is applied so thinly. You can see right through it to the canvas beneath. Durand we looked at very briefly. The other Fauve, remember that Matisse and Durand had spent that summer in Collioure together in 1905 in the south of France. And I had in my notes, I don't know, he's kind of like he's so last year. He's more like what Matisse had been when he did the Luxe Calme et Volupté, where you can see the individual strokes. Not everywhere, but predominantly in those trees in the foreground. And his paint is also applied with this idea of playing back and forth between the thinner areas and the thicker areas. And you get a sense of a really sort of robust exchange of ideas between these two artists. So I've got some nice details. We already talked about the unnaturally chosen colors for the trunks of the trees, right? Or even the wall, right? That's meant to be a stone wall running behind it in purple. But also then these amazing patches of blue and orange in the tree that he's using to evoke the idea of shadows and less so highlights, right? And this then juxtaposes with the sky up above, where he begins to blend it all together and becomes the sort of movement of colors across the sky. And you can see that, like Matisse, he's leaving a lot of the canvas either bare or looking like it's bare. And again, the point there is that it's not about the representation. It is about this two-dimensional object that I might argue is actually a three-dimensional object, but a very thin one, right? But this object that we're looking at, rather than, it's not about trying to help us feel too much about what the mountains at Collioure really look like or feel like. That's the inspiration for something entirely different, right? And again, as we get closer in, we can see, again, working with the different surfaces. So some of those blues are very thinly applied, and you can see the weave of the canvas through them. And then other sections are immediately next to that, very, very thick, and we can still see the streaks from the brush that Durand used to lay the tones down. Help me out here, Mr. Wi-Fi. Change, darn you. Try it one more time. Change. There we go. Right. It's nice. It's worth waiting for. That's a lovely detail, right? This flower just right in here. And again, I think gives us a sense of, there is an immediacy, right? You can see where the wet brush lifted off of the canvas and left those peaks coming off like a meringue, right? If you're in the kitchen, really wonderful. Durand mentioned quite specifically that one of his major influences was Van Gogh. We'd already talked about the importance of Gauguin for the Fauves. But Van Gogh is equally important. We haven't really talked about Van Gogh in this class yet. He was friends with Gauguin. He had also lived in the south of France, which of course is near where Drouin and Matisse are. He was in the town of Arles. Was dead for over 15 years by time Drouin and Matisse were there. They didn't meet. But they knew his works. And in fact, Matisse even owned some paintings by Van Gogh. And I think this one makes a nice comparison just as a lucky coincidence over in the Phillips collection near DuPont, in that it really does show us some of how Van Gogh applies paint. And we can see that what Drouin has done in particular, and I think Matisse as well, is to take a Van Gogh approach to the independent personality of the brushstroke and take it a step further past representation. One of the great things about Van Gogh, one of the things that remains, I think, on people's mind when we talk in loving terms about his works, is the degree to which the paint application, the way the paint hits the canvas in Van Gogh, that the strokes themselves seem to have identity, right? A unique identity. And that identity, of course, is linked to Van Gogh's own identity, right? Or personality. So when we look at the trees in the upper right corner by the sky, or even the way he handles the sky itself, and I wish I could show you a lot of these, it's not difficult to see a step between this and Drouin, right? Because Van Gogh is already moving in the direction of non-representational color, although impressionistically it still looks like it, right? This is a bit blue for an evergreen tree, but it's still an evergreen tree. And the brushstrokes still kind of come together so that you get a sense of what the organic thing was that he's trying to paint. And Drouin breaks that apart. It just starts to sort of push in a new direction away from that. Another nice, we're lucky, I've got a dozen Van Goghs, right? There really is a good collection here. Another picture that I think makes a wonderful comparison with Drouin. Sometimes these things, I look at them and I think, did he know that picture? Right? And there's no way to prove it, that he knew this picture, but then look at the treatment of the sky in both of these. One of the things that Van Gogh started doing when he started painting outside, which is only about a year earlier than this, right, that he actually started painting outside. One of the things he started doing was he started to play with color opposites being placed next to each other, with the idea that it provided vibrancy to the surface of the painting. So if you look down in the foreground, the greens and the reds right next to each other, right? Look in the sky, and you've got pinks next to blues, right? You've got these near opposites on the color wheel. And the color wheel is a relatively new kind of invention at that point. I think it's like the 1860s we see the color wheel come out. And Van Gogh is very much interested in sort of playing with these juxtapositions. And there was another painter who told him all about this. You got to do this and make your painting more lively. And so he does. And I think that is also an important step toward Fauvism, which at that point you're using color not for representation, but you're using color for compositional effect, right? And you tie that into the way he applies paint. Look, lower right corner next to the road, and you start to see those areas of the road color merging in with the yellow grass in a way that just sort of breaks up the yellow grass, and you flip your eyes back over to Drouin. There's just something so similar in their approach. It's just that Drouin is sort of pushing it further, right? Taking those ideas and in a way almost, I don't want to say being more brave than Van Gogh, because that's not really the case, right? It's just thinking of possibilities that Van Gogh hadn't thought of yet, right? because of the difference in the time that they were working. I love the two stone walls as well, and almost exactly the same tone, right, that run through both of these paintings and applied, the paint applied in also very similar fashion with these, the stones just kind of evoked by these strokes that then form a rhythm across the painting. And again, there's Van Gogh's use of alternative colors, that orange dot right in the middle of the stone wall that has no explanation in observed reality. It's there because of the composition. Let's see where I am with this. Who's up next? Where's page 2 of my notes? I guess it doesn't matter. I'm not really paying attention to them anyway. Right? A third artist that was... Oh, there's nothing up there. Come on. Wi-Fi? There we go. A third artist that joined in this same show. Remember, this is the autumn exhibition, the Salon d'automne, the Salon of the Fall. And Matisse had gathered artists together who were working in a similar style, championing the idea of color. Right? Maurice de Vlaminck was a third of the artists that exhibited together in this exact same show. He was entirely self-taught. So if any of these artists was really a wild beast, remember that's what fauvism means, right? Wild beast. If any of them were a wild beast, it was probably Vlaminck. Because Matisse had been academically trained, Derain had been academically trained. For them, this style was a choice, right? A very conscious move away from what they had been trained to do. They learned the rules and then broke them. But Vlaminck, being self-trained, is able to sort of just go immediately off in his own direction, right? Didn't necessarily have the same level of draftsmanship, of proper paint handling technique that either Matisse or Derain did. And in fact, he even had a couple quotes about what painting should be the undiluted expression of an artist's temperament, right? That you should see feeling, right, in the work itself, undiluted, right, not watered down at all. That you should get a sense of artistic temperament from looking at the paint handling. He said that painting should be ferocious, he says, or even at other times tender. That these things made the painting closer to life itself. Now, for being self-trained, I still think he's pretty darn good. And still, as we look at his painting, we can find the fauve tendencies there, right? The breaking up of the brushstrokes, the application of bright, sensuous colors, often in combinations that are sometimes jarring in their juxtapositions. Certainly picking up the thicker application, though, less of the bare canvas showing through, right? Maybe a little closer to Van Gogh in spirit that way, right? You should keep in mind that even though the Fauves were a group in 1905, there wasn't a manifesto. They didn't have to check off the list of things that they would do, right? The one thing that binds them all together is their exploration, celebration of color, right? Finally, two other artists who showed in 1905 together, and we can see that there's a range of sort of paint application techniques. Albert Marquet and Raoul Dufy, also part of this same group, and you can see both of them equally interested in these extraordinarily saturated, bright colors, even though the application of the paint for each of them is not the same as Matisse or Derain, or for that matter, Vlaminck. Right? Marquet picks up on the bright colors one sees at the coast, at the various amusement parks and vendors that one sees there. Dufy picks up on the colors of atmosphere. Neither of them were in the same part of France. Dufy and Marquet were working in northern France, whereas Matisse and Derain were down in the south, right? And this again indicates to us the degree to which Matisse is this major player, because he sees these different artists working in different regions, attempting similar effects. And he's the one that organizes them as a group for this very brief time in 1905. And almost immediately they begin to go their different ways, right? Again, remember that it was not a formal group. There was no membership list or anything like that. There was this show where color exploded and critics reacted. Now, I want to spend the rest of today, and we probably will bleed over a bit into Tuesday, looking at the rest of Matisse's career. It's a very, very long career. This is 1905. He lives 50 more years, right? And we've looked at 1905 with some specificity. We certainly can't do that with the rest of his career, right? But we're going to see that what happened to him during this period, his experience with the Fauves, is absolutely crucial to really the entirety of his life's work, right? So this is exhibited in Paris about 6 months after the Fauve exhibition. There was another exhibition in the spring, right? The Independence Salon, it was called. And this goes into that show, but he's probably working on it the summer before when he was in Collioure, right? And but it's not evocative of a particular place in the way the open window was and the way that Derain's picture was. And this goes up within 6 months of the brouhaha surrounding the Fauve show, right? And it meets with the exact same sort of critical negativity, right? Again, who paints like this is kind of what the critics say, right? What's with all the bright colors? Why isn't there any black, right? Why is it so flat? The exact same sort of things that greeted the rest of the group in the fall previous to that, in the fall of 1905, right? It is a very, very large work. It's in the Barnes Collection in Philadelphia, and which has recently moved to downtown Philadelphia. So I brought this just to give you a sense of scale, right? Because I've mentioned before, you're right, that when artists paint large, they are intending this as a statement. Things that we tend to take for granted when we study art, titles and scale often have an important thing to tell us, right? Large paintings are meant to have a presence. Small paintings intended to have an intimate reaction with you, the viewer, right? Invite you to bury yourself in it. These are intended to be like billboards, proclaiming intentions. What does the artist want to do, right? This was his biggest painting he had ever made up to this point in his career. He'll make bigger ones later, right? But up to this point, in 1905, when he paints this canvas, he decides, I'm going to go on this project. This is what I'm going to do. It's the biggest painting he'd ever done, right? Imagine, who's graduating? None of you are graduating this year. Right? This is a senior project. I'm going to take on the biggest painting I've ever done. You're going to put some thought into that, right? You're going to say, this is going to be pretty important. I'm going to spend a lot of money on this, right? Regardless of whether or not it sells, this is going to be an important statement about what I think art is all about. And that's certainly the case with the joy of life, right? Joie de vivre in French, is that this was meant to be a visual manifesto, right? There was no manifesto for the Fauves, like there had been for the Symbolist movement. But I think that Matisse sees this as a visual manifesto, not for the Fauves, just for Matisse. This is why I'm here. This is what I'm doing. This is where I'm going with my art. And when I phrase it on those terms, right, this is who I am, this is where I'm going, it's hard not to think of Gauguin, right? What are we? Where are we going? Where did we come from? I think that title could apply to The Joy of Life as well. Because as a visual manifesto, not only is it telling us what Matisse is all about as a painter, what am I, right? I think it also bears out eventually that this is where he's going too. And we'll see how that bears out. But it also addresses the question of where he came from. What are the influences that are coming together to make Matisse Matisse? So where is he going, right? You'll notice that the color has really abandoned that broken, dashy, post-pointillist application entirely, right? There's almost none of it left. Some grass in the blue in the foreground. But the majority of it are colors that are in these sort of fields, a little bit more like Gauguin that way, right? Where they're surrounded and become these large cut jigsaw puzzle pieces of pink and blue and yellow. Right? Sometimes you get the transitions, the reclining figure in the middle surrounded by red on one side and green on the other. Those are color opposites, right? Playing next to each other. But none of it really, there's a root in observed nature, but only sort of traces. So the tree trunks that we see on the right by the flute player, on the left by the group over there, end up being dividers between color sections. And again, maybe I might have him come in. Maybe Cézanne comes to mind, where he would use the trees as ways of separating out areas where he would interact with the paint. And Matisse is doing very much the same thing. And the painting is for, modern is not my gig, right? I do Renaissance art. That's my gig. But this is an art historian's treasure trove. Because as this visual manifesto of where he's headed, what he's doing, and where he came from, every figural group here has roots somewhere in the history of art. And he spent time working through each of the small figure groupings, thinking about where is Matisse's place in the grand scheme of things. Art has a huge legacy. Where do I fit in? And as we look through the different things that Matisse was looking at, we find an extraordinary range of things, but I think it continues to come back to that idea that there is only order and beauty, right? That quote from Baudelaire that's at the root of The Joy of Life is, I think, a crucial thing with this. So I just did the ones that I knew right off the top of my head from looking at this, right? And I think that if you spent time, you could find a gazillion others, right? So a figure on the left and you'll notice she has flowers draping around her body, is based on a type of Venus, right? An image of Venus from ancient Greek and Roman sculpture, where she is rising from the sea and wringing out her hair, wringing the water from her hair. And he sort of translated that. So there's a Roman statue here. There's a painting by the 19th century painter Ingres, I-N-G-R-E-S, on the far right, that's based on these variations, right? Picking up images that have a kind of solid tradition through the centuries, right? And then translating them into his image. The figure in the center also roots in Rome, roots in the Renaissance, roots in the Baroque period. At the top, you might remember that. We saw that in Rome when we were there a couple years ago, right? The sleeping hermaphrodite, half man, half woman, right? That you can only see from the other side which is which. But certainly the overall pose of this, translated through painters like Velázquez in 17th century Spain at the bottom, end up becoming this sort of figure that we see in the middle with her back to us and her red hair flowing. Right? It's ripe with references. It's reference heavy. The other figure, okay. This is really bad today. The other figure next to her facing us is, again, sort of reference through time. I'm sorry, that's like pixelated out. Try that one more time and see if it's better. There, is that better? Yeah. Ariadne at the top. We also saw her in when we were there. Sleeping Ariadne, the bride-to-be of the god of wine, right? Dionysus, or Bacchus, choose your god, right? But having washed up ashore and sleeping, about to be awakened. Or on the bottom, an odalisque, Eastern Turkish harem girl, or maybe Moroccan harem girl by Ang again. Notice the luxuriousness of all of this. Notice it's all about love, right? The harem girl is one of the bevy doing the sultan's sexual favors, but being serenaded by music as well. You'll notice that ours makes references to music with the pipe player in the back, looking very much like Orpheus, playing their pipes to soothe the animals. Right? Like I said, everything we look is just, it's the history of art in a picture, right? The dancers in the middle that add to this idea of the joy of life, right, through love and relaxation. I pulled in a Botticelli that immediately came to mind. I couldn't, you couldn't just stop there. There's a million other places you could look for images of frolicking in the countryside. Because it's local, I yanked a picture of a pot in from Johns Hopkins up in Baltimore, where we can see this idea of dancing in the round, in fact, has its base in ancient Greek art. So what we see in this picture is that Matisse is really channeling the history of art as a group, but not every single corner, right? And it's important to focus on what he's interested in. Ancient Greece and Rome is obviously key. The classical world, a golden age that he's trying to revive. And that's something that we saw when we looked at the earlier picture, Lux comme et volupté. That Matisse is very much interested in using art to revive, to create a new golden age, right? Remember, there is only order and beauty. Right? Those are the hallmarks of ancient Greek art. He loves the Renaissance, right? He loves Baroque art. Renaissance is all order and beauty. Baroque is luxuriousness. And he particularly loves Ang out of the 19th century. It's important to think of these things. He's not interested in deeply disturbing romantic imagery. He's not interested in Gothic art, right? The things that he's interested really are the things that support his central idea of using art to create a better world, right? To surround himself. And I think, this is one of the reasons why Matisse remains, at least for me, if I'm going to narrow modern art down and say, okay, somebody gives me the power to own a work of modern art, I might choose a Matisse for exactly this reason, right? The world's pretty crappy. Newspapers increasingly hard to read every day simply because nothing seems good. Heck, the New York Times these days now has on their online version, bad news got you down, here are 5 good stories, But you got a Matisse on the wall, and you've got a corner of the world where nothing sucks, right? Where everything is order and beauty, right? Luxuriousness, calmness, right? And I think for me, that's the most extraordinary thing for Matisse. Now, it's not only where he's been, it's where he's going as well. These are the ideas that he's going to continue to work with regularly through the rest of his 50-year career. Right? So this is really an important picture to him. So up in Baltimore, the Baltimore Museum is a very, very large picture. It's a good 5 feet across, right? Simply called the Blue Nude, or the Souvenir of Biskra. He had visited North Africa and painting from memory some of the things he had seen in North Africa. He takes that same pose of the sleeping Ariadne that he had worked for The Joy of Life, and he reworks it a year and a half later with a lot of tones of blue, so it's picked up this nickname of the Blue Nude. Not only has he been to North Africa, we can see the palm trees behind it, right? That evoking an exotic site for this image. But he also begins to morph the figure to resemble African sculpture that he'd been seeing as well. There was a new ethnographic museum open in Paris that Matisse was very much interested in. And one of the things we'll see artists in the 20th century become increasingly interested in is an idea of what they would call primitivism, looking to pre-industrial, non-Western civilizations for, again, inspiration on how to get away from tradition, right? And for Matisse, sculptures like this one, which were on easy access view in Paris, give him the inspiration for changing the shape of the outline of the body, the proportions of the legs, the hips, the breasts, the arms, away from representation towards something significantly more expressive. So African sculpture remains for him a very, very strong influence. Two details here. It's important as we look at this to realize with many of these pictures the degree to which Matisse is working it, and finally deciding he's done. So if we look at her supporting arm, the one on which she's kneeling, you can see how much he shifted it around on the composition. Right? Narrowed it, moved it. It's not fast, even though it's roughly painted. It is not intended to be a quick study. He arrives at that simplicity through the course of significant hours of work. So the hand on the forehead that's just simply roughed in, right, and looks spontaneous is, I think, anything but. Her face, which is reduced to almost what you could do as a quick gesture, right? I could ask you to do this with your pen in 5 strokes, and you could do it, right? But that's not how Matisse painted it. Right? So if we look at that arm, if we look at her shoulder, we can see him working with the paint still, right? So that the dialogue with how that paint is on the canvas is, for him, as important as the thing he's painting. Right? To the point where, for example, her rib cage starts to look kind of wonky, doesn't it? Especially on the bottom side, to where it almost looks like it's some sort of goiter there under her breast, right? It just sort of sits out because, again, he's interested in playing with these areas and working with the color within them. I was in Baltimore last weekend, and I hadn't ever seen this before, so I thought I'd bring it in for you. How much sketching there is, even before he starts to paint, right? The entire thing is just, he's an incredible dialogue between him and his activity and this record of sort of finding it there somewhere, right? So as we look at her knee, all of those scratches are drawings on the canvas that he's painted over with varying degrees of success. He wants us to still see them, right? Because he's eventually done with this, right? And when he's done with it, that's still visible. He hasn't painted over it. So that idea of eventually arriving at what the finished form is, he wants us to understand that. He wants us to see that dialogue. And then other areas, the blue that comes over the top, right? Or I was really kind of caught up with that pink on the back leg and how sort of adamantly that's painted pink. Whereas other areas are a lot of the canvas sort of showing through very thin washes of paint, right? So the color areas are getting bigger, aren't they, on a certain level? And the paint application is changing from his fauve years, morphing as he moves through time. But color still remains the central purpose, right? And again, he's not done with his ideas yet, right? Again, you're the only non-art person in here. But for all the people that do studio art, right? You got an idea, man. I remember when I was a studio artist, I never spent enough time saying I'm not done with this yet, right? I need to rework this idea again because there's something there I'm getting toward, and I like the picture, good, right? But I haven't finished working out that idea yet, and I got to start another one to sort of explore some things that I couldn't explore back there. And I think that idea of having a body of work that picks up ideas and works them through and sometimes repeats them and redevelops them in different directions is an important way, because if it hasn't become clear, the way I kind of approach art is that art is a form of, the history of modern art is the history of ideas, right? It's artists wrestling with concepts and ideas and trying to give them visual form. And I think that's a lesson for all of us, is that art is more than just beauty. Art is ideas, and sometimes we need a second draft, right? Even if the first one's great, we should never think that we're done with ideas, because that's true for writers. That's true for everybody. I think that our ideas are what makes us individuals and what makes us human. We got to keep working those things, right? One of his more famous works, right? He takes that centerpiece of the joy of life, and he just explodes it in this monster picture. This is there are two different versions of this. This one's in Russia. The other one's in MoMA. Slightly less lurid colors with the MoMA version. But it must be 8 feet across the base. Maybe even bigger, 8 or 9 feet across. Right? It was made for a prominent Russian collector who commissioned it from him. Didn't like it at first, almost rejected it, and then ended up taking it. But even though he's abandoned a lot of the fauve stylings, right? The things that kind of looked similar in 1905. You can see the color is still everything, right? These broad expanses of color. And it's not about the color being at all representational, right? The color is there for its expressive qualities, its evocation of mood, harmony, and beauty. I love this picture. I would take this home tomorrow if I had a wall big enough to put a 9-foot picture on, which I don't. Right? Notice the degree to which he plays with anatomies. Look at the hunchback of the figure in the center at the top. Right? He doesn't intend it to be a hunchback. That's not the point. Right? The point is that he's interested in how it worked with the relationship between that back and the edge of the canvas. And he realized he needed to push things around in order to make them work. It was part of a pair of pictures that were commissioned from him in 1910. The other one showing music. And both of these works really display for us this idea of what is Matisse all about? Environment. He's about creating a world of harmony and beauty. And for Matisse, art plays a role in that, but so does music. Right? Because music surrounds us. Music is harmony. Music is pure beauty. And in fact, a number of artists in the early 20th century looked to music as being the purest art form, not bound up with representation. Beauty for its own sake. Right? And Matisse is one of a number of artists who are interested in the analogy between music and visual art. And certainly our panpipe player in the center with that very simplified face, also lifted directly out of the joy of life, right, where he's standing instead. I should have brought it in, but I didn't. These flat red figures against the colored background comes right out of Greek pottery. There's a whole group of Greek pots called red figure pottery. Here, I got an idea. We have enough time to do this. I think I can do this. To just find that picture here, and I'll put it in. and then we'll have it to look at. So you know what I'm talking about there. Insert picture. I just have to find a good one. I'm just going to grab any. This may not be the best example, but I'm going to grab any old one I can. Vases. Well, here. Bum, 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 back. Come on. Yeah, right. Great red figure pottery. Okay. And this is certainly, again, evoking this idea of a golden age, right? That he is reestablishing in the modern world. Strength after strength, right? Color for him is everything. And again, color is not representation. Remember that old quote, when I paint green, it is not grass. When I paint blue, it is not sky. Well, here he's involved. Colors become everything. It's the entire interior is red, right? Extraordinary, insofar as a way of trying to illustrate something. Yeah.
I was gonna say it kind of looks like that Van Gogh painting, the bedroom.
The bedroom, right? The interesting thing about the Van Gogh painting, and this would be something to look into with that, right? Yeah. So if you don't know, there's this painting by Van Gogh he did. He did two of them actually. Of his bedroom. One's in Amsterdam, and the other one is, I think, in Cleveland, right? Sort of raking perspective like this, and there's his bed, and everything kind of has a similar tonality in it, right? Kind of a purplish color, which is, by the way, not the original color of that picture, right? Originally, it did have more range, but the pigments have all sort of faded over time because of the pigments he was using, right? And I'd be curious to know whether or not Matisse saw it in its original state or how soon it faded. Right? But I think that's a very good point, right? We've seen that Van Gogh was a key part of this. And I think that for each of them, what they see in the room, right, and this, I've got some details to show you this as well, is they see the room more than just a sort of inert space, right? That for each of them, the room has life. The room has personality. The room has unique qualities that the artist wants to bring forth through the painting of it. And why do you paint what you paint? Right? You find something visually attractive with it, but hopefully you're trying to get us to see something we don't see otherwise. What particularly struck me about this one is not only is the room all red, but a lot of the things in the room are red. So that the only way we can tell that there's a grandfather clock or a chest of drawers or a cane chair is by that faint outline around it in yellow, which is underneath the red, right? And you'll notice with the chair in the foreground, lower right corner, that he's mucking with perspective, right? He wants the top bar of that chair to sort of follow the line of the table that's behind it, right? And you'll notice how the cane chair has a very different treatment than I think that's a basket chair behind it. Because he had been to, there was a major exhibition of Persian North African textiles that he had gone to see in Munich. And he was struck, he wrote about it, he was very much struck by how the textiles as used by North African cultures, Morocco and whatnot, how those textiles had created a sort of unified interior aesthetic. And people often look at this picture and say this is kind of a variation of that same idea. But what I particularly like about this picture is the degree to which it fits in what I've been talking about. Why do you make art? What is the role of art in the life of the individual? Right? Art has an important role to play for us. And as we look at this picture, we realize that everything in the room that is kind of mundane is red. The walls are red, the floor is red, that old school cane chair is red, those two bar stools are red, the tables, and the chest of drawers. And what's not red? Art, right? Art changes the environment. This amplifies the degree to which, and they're all paintings by Matisse, by the way, right? They're paintings of his own paintings inside the painting. Right? Art's role is to break up the monotony of everyday life. And he amplifies that idea by turning the rest of the studio red. Right? And it doesn't mean that the studio becomes an unpleasant place to be, but things that are artistic, and notice this extends not only to the art, but to a wine glass, right? To a bottle with flowers growing out of it. Things of beauty. Matisse applied his art to everything. That's a Matisse-designed plate in the foreground. His charcoal set, his drawing tools on the table in the foreground are colored, not red, right? Art's role, the face of the clock, the hand-painted part of the clock, right? It's art that's special. It's art that stands out. It's art that's important. So here are a few details, right? Matisse was a sculptor. We didn't look at Matisse's sculpture. I wish we had the time. Fantastic sculptor, right? We'll see one coming up. Paintings finished and unfinished, right? Bowl full of paintbrushes on the side table. That's painted as well, right? Oop. Hang on a second. There we go, right? I love how he's paying attention to how he applies the paint to the paintings in the painting. How's that for a tongue twister, right? But it's not just enough to sort of, he's painting the painting as if it were its own painting. Does that make sense, right? It's not enough just to get it there. But I love also how sometimes the paint on the painting changes based on what's in front of it. So notice how that pink in our reclining figure, how the paint moves around the stems of that flower, right? Because again, it's not about color blending, it's about color combinations, right? Is what he's most focused on. That's wonderful because it looks unfinished, and he's even given us a painting in the painting that has the drawing on it, right? It's a terrific work, right? And it's huge, too. Yeah. Am I going to see different things coming out of Mary's classes now that you're looking at she loves Matisse, by the way. Don't talk to Mary about Matisse, right? And then this wonderful, wonderful plate in the foreground in his I would assume either those charcoal or those things that Sarah has you use for blending your charcoal with, right? Well, got about 3 minutes left. I've got a lot of Matisse left. We're only in 1916. But he's worth stopping. The importance of art in life. What does art do? In 1914, you know your European history. What happens in France in 1914? Pretty big thing. One of two in the 20th century, the war, right? 1914 to 18 is World War I. Matisse is too old. By 1914, he's about 45 or so. And he also, I believe he has a medical condition that keeps him from being called up. Because I don't think they were as concerned as they were like in Vietnam, where they only took the 18-year-olds, you know. He would have been called up, but he was in fact medically discharged, if you will, medically. So he stays home and paints, right? And in fact, 1917, this is still in Paris, but the next year he moves to the south of France for the rest of his life, right? Down to the Mediterranean. But here, this is his home, right? And it's another of these pictures that is a celebration of the importance of art in life. And I think that this is where Matisse, this is why I resonate so much with Matisse, because this is painted in the height of the war, right? It is everywhere around him. It is in the news. It is dangerous. It is loud. It is ugly. We'll find out as we look at the Germans from this period how horrible World War I was? I mean, we've sanitized war so much. You push buttons now. You send drones, right? This was mustard gas, right? This was first use of tanks. This was hand-to-hand combat in the mud, right? You saw the person you killed. You smelled them. You were that close. It was a horrible time to be alive. What is Matisse doing during this? Because he can't go to war. Not that, I don't see him as anti-patriotic. He's creating a world of harmony and peace. And there's something to be said for that, right? There is only balance and harmony, right? So here, this is his family. Those are his kids. That's his wife. Piano lesson, right? Reading a book, his older son. I think that's the nanny outside, right? The servant outside. Knitting, I think, maybe. Petting a cat, it's hard to say, right? But in the garden, as we look through the window, and again, he's flattened it out, hasn't he? We don't look through, we look at, right? But there's our open window. That's a Matisse sculpture. You recognize her, right? She's the blue nude, but sculpted. Yes, he did this, right? Here's a small one up in Baltimore. That's a big one, right? This is small bronze. In fact, if you go to Baltimore, on the wall just out of my frame here is the blue nude, right? These are from the same period. And there he's put her in the garden. Whether he did one that big, I don't know. I don't care. He didn't paint from observation. He painted from this idea of creating a space. What is the role of art in the everyday life of the individual? What is the importance of art? The arts, literature, music, sculpture, right? Craft. The painting on the wall is his painting, right? And he's translated the colors of that painting to fit within this interior, right? He is, and we go back to the Red Studio, he is creating everything about his world, right? He's going to make a world where everything in it is going to make it better, make life better, right down to the plates he serves his olives on, which he'll paint up himself. And I wish I had the time and the talent, right? But I wish I had the time to create that kind of total environment around me where if this is where I live, then this is who I am. And make it that way. And I just get so inspired by this and wish I didn't have a job, Wish I didn't have to go sit on a committee or work on Tuesday's lecture, right? That I could just go home now and get out go to Goodwill, buy some plates and get out some paints and just do something with it, right? Make it better. That's the lesson of Matisse, right? Okay, I kept you a minute late. On Tuesday, we'll wrap up Matisse. There's some really interesting things coming with Matisse as well. And move on to Cubism, right? Don't hesitate to ask me if you have questions about the upcoming research project assignment. If you need some coaching on where you might want to go with modern art. I hope I don't get 7 people who want to do Matisse, right? As much as I wouldn't mind reading 7 papers on Matisse, I don't want you arm wrestling for the books, right? So be sure you look over that list. And again, work on your first draft and be sure you treat the draft as a completed work, right? That's the important thing. We often think of drafts as like, I can get the first 2 paragraphs and write at the bottom, I'm going to finish this, right? You should think about the draft as being as good as you can do, right? Okay, have a good weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday.